The morning air was thick with the taste of oil and dust. Engines thundered over the fractured tarmac, vibrating the ground beneath the mechanic's boots as wave after wave of B-24s climbed into the dark blue haze. 20 minutes into the mission, not long after sunrise, one of the bombers, a battered Liberator known as Sweet Pea, suddenly veered sideways within the tight southern formation, its left wing dropping dangerously toward the olive groves below. Inside the aircraft, sweat coated everything like a second skin. Grease-slick panels shuddered beneath uneasy boots. The scent of diesel, cordite, and scorched rubber clung stubbornly to the flesh. Staff Sergeant Al Grissom held tight to a bulkhead bar near the rear hatch, bracing himself instinctively against the quaking floor. A wrench dangled from his belt. He wasn't meant to be on this flight, but after a last-second crew change and a faulty fuel reading, he'd been ordered aboard. "Just for the first stretch," the captain had muttered, "in case anything acts up." Something already had. A harsh metal clack-clack rang out from beneath the fuselage, not once, not twice. It came steady, growing louder, a rhythm Grissom couldn't mistake. It was pressure working up behind the landing gear doors. His eyes shot downward. He recognized the sound. He'd heard it before while standing safely on the ground, watching another B-24 rip itself apart during ascent. A new vibration started creeping through the floor. It wasn't the usual engine shake. This was different. Looser, more erratic, like invisible claws shredding the underside of the aircraft. Grissom shoved past the radio operator, ducked below the waist gunner's post, and yanked the inspection panel open with trembling, raw fingers. What he saw made his stomach clench. The left landing gear strut was rattling hard, barely held in place by 2 bolts and a single scrap of rope no thicker than his finger. That rope, his rope, was pulled tight, trembling violently under strain. If it gave way, even by half an inch, the gear would drop and the airflow would rip the door open with devastating force. "Captain!" he shouted into the intercom, but only a wall of static answered back. They were already skimming the treetops. The ground surged upward, a blur of dirt and stone. Romanian forest streaked past just beneath the wings. Grissom hit his knees, grabbing the rope with one hand while pressing down on the strut with the other. It howled under the pressure. His gloves slid. One of the knots had already frayed apart. With every passing second, the strain worsened. The noise outside thickened. Deep, warping thunder. Flack. Black puffs of smoke erupted in the sky ahead, their blasts rocking the aircraft like a loose sheet of tin in a storm. The nose gunner opened fire blindly. A second Liberator veered sharply to the right, flames trailing from its left engine before it vanished into a row of cypress trees. No chutes, no explosion, just silence. Grissom didn't turn to look. Instead, he slipped his arm through a steel cable, leaned his body against the access panel, and locked his eyes on the rope. It groaned. A single thread snapped. Just one. The sky was collapsing inward. In less than 2 minutes, they'd be in range of the outer flak perimeter. Then came the jolt. Sudden, sharp, and violent enough to steal his breath. Grissom froze, convinced the strut had broken loose. But it hadn't. The rope held. He stared at it, in disbelief. That damned rope still held. He backed away slowly, his heart slamming so hard it nearly drowned out the flak bursts. The metal creaked, the wind howled, and the rope stretched to its very limit, but didn't give. The bomber roared ahead into the storm of fire. Grissom collapsed into the belly of the aircraft, soaked in sweat, dizzy, deafened, and gripping the torn edge of the open hatch. Above him, the rope danced in the rushing air, pulled tight between survival and catastrophe. The base reeked of exhaust fumes and sweat-soaked uniforms. Metal slammed and clattered through the night, bouncing off oil-streaked hangars and sagging canvas tents. Beneath the steady engine thunder and the sharp commands of flight officers, something quieter lingered. dread. Mechanics toiled under lanterns, their hands shaking as they worked on fuselages already patched 3 or 4 times. Bombers returned crippled, if they made it back at all. No one bothered asking the names of the crews that didn't. On paper, it was preparation for a low-altitude strategic bombing mission. In reality, it was a death sentence. Operation Tidal Wave meant sending 178 B-24s under radar across hostile skies to strike the oil fields at Ploesti from treetop height. The maps marked the targets as heavily defended. The truth was worse. 50,000 enemy troops, hundreds of flak guns, overlapping kill zones, hidden pillboxes, all aimed directly at the sky. Still, that wasn't the part that kept Al Grissom from sleeping. He'd served with the 98th Bomb Group for 9 months, rebuilding engines and repairing battered aircraft with stripped screws and worn-out tools. But no checklist, no order from HQ, and no technical sheet ever addressed the one failure that truly haunted him: the gear door malfunction. Ground crews all knew it. Pilots feared it. But nobody higher up dared to acknowledge it. The B-24's gear doors were never built to handle low-level speeds in combat zones. At 200 miles per hour, flying low, wind funneled under the thin belly skin and forced itself into every crack and panel. On some aircraft, the gear doors would start rattling mid-run, throwing off airflow and creating dangerous drag. If the landing gear came loose even slightly, the wind could grab it and wrench the whole system apart. The result was always the same: the plane tearing open mid-air, trees full of bodies, fire in the fields, nothing but silence on the comms. Inspections were pointless. The bolts would stay, right up until they didn't. Some blamed it on aging planes. Others said it was wear from earlier missions. Command dismissed it as pilot mishandling. But Grissom had seen otherwise. He'd watched a bomber limp home with half its gear stuck down, the pilot shouting over the radio, his co-pilot soaked in blood from broken glass. He'd worked on a wreck split wide open, its underside peeled back like a tin of sardines. And once, deep in the shattered remains of a Liberator, he'd found a gear door hinge jammed by a bolt snapped clean in half. That wasn't carelessness. That was metal fatigue, plain and simple. Weak steel giving in to brutal wind. No one above him wanted to hear it. Requests for stronger parts vanished into red tape. Replacement supplies were tightly limited. Senior engineers dismissed it as combat variants. But Grissom knew better. This wasn't guesswork, it was mechanics, and the cost of ignoring it was paid in lives. So he began to count. In just 3 weeks, 17 B-24s had been pulled from duty due to suspected gear door failures mid-flight. That meant around 170 airmen gone, mostly dead, some marked non-recoverable. And this was all before the actual operation had even begun. Yet the orders still came down. Strip the plane, inspect it, recheck, sign off, and get it back in the sky. The mechanics pushed through it with sunken eyes, some whispering half-formed prayers. Grissom said nothing. He just worked harder, triple-checking landing struts, welding reinforcements where none were required. But even that wasn't enough. One night, while getting Sweet Pea ready for her 4th sortie, he spotted a young mechanic wrench a bent strut into place using a rusted pipe. The kid wiped the sweat from his brow with a hand wrapped in gauze, not realizing the part he just forced into position already had hairline fractures from the previous flight. That was the moment it hit Grissom. Bolts weren't the answer. Reinforcements couldn't stop this. The whole system was failing and no fix from the manual would ever come in time. And the mission was now only 6 days away. The desert wind pushed through the rows of tents, thick with the smell of oil, grit, and bone-deep fatigue. Mechanics toiled until their shadows melted into the pavement, their backs hunched under flickering floodlights powered by a moaning generator. Somewhere in the distance, a sergeant was yelling about a missing component. Another cursed loudly over a seized bearing. Grissom didn't speak. He sat quietly on an overturned crate beside a gutted B-24, staring at a heap of landing gear assemblies that shimmered like pale bones in the dim light. His mind wasn't on bolts or hinges anymore. He was thinking about leverage, about how to hold tension, how to resist failure without relying solely on steel. His fingers were dry and cracked from solvent, his eyes bloodshot from breathing in fumes. But something small, something almost absurd, kept nagging at him. It started with a simple image. A supply jeep pulling in next to the hangar, loaded with ammunition crates strapped down using rough army rope. The knots held firm despite every jolt the vehicle took. The coarse hemp strained, but never failed. When the wheels hit a small ditch, one crate shifted slightly, then snapped back into place from the rope's pull. It looked unimportant, but to Grissom, it meant everything. He rose to his feet. The idea struck so clearly it drowned out the engines, the shouting, even the exhaustion. This wasn't about reinforcing failing parts. It was about preventing movement before it ever began. He pulled a frayed length of rope from a supply bin and cut it to size with a dull maintenance knife. The texture felt rough and alive in his hands. The fibers left red marks across his skin. Crawling beneath the left wing of a grounded B-24, he slid into the gear compartment, where the hydraulic arms hung silent and cold. The air stank of rubber and stale fuel. His flashlight beam trembled as he got to work. He wrapped one end of the rope around the inner strut, looping it twice, then threaded the other end through a bolt flange near the airframe's edge. He left a few inches of slack, enough to let the gear deploy normally on takeoff, but just short enough to lock it firmly once the plane was airborne. A crude failsafe, using pure tension instead of complicated mechanics. It would hold the door tight against the fuselage. If the wind tried to pry it open, the rope would resist. Nothing elegant, just brute resistance. He tugged it by hand, hard. The knot didn't budge. The strut stayed locked. It was absurd. It was brilliant. It broke every rule. If the rope locked during landing, the plane could go down. If it tore loose, it might get caught in the prop or damage the gear housing. Grissom was fully aware of the risks, but he also knew what happened when nothing was done. He leaned against the cold fuselage, inhaling the metallic bite of midnight air. His hands shook slightly as he retied the knot, tighter, cleaner this time. Then he added a tag, just a scrap of torn ration paper with a few scribbled words. Remove if fails. He tucked it into the gear housing and stepped back. The hangar was quiet except for the soft ticking of engines cooling in the dark. He could hear his own pulse. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong, reckless, disobedient, maybe even enough to end his career. But beneath that fear was something else, something sharper. Conviction. He repeated the fix on 2 more aircraft, moving quickly, crouched low in the shadows to avoid the roving MPs. The moonlight turned the rope pale as bone against the dark frame of the planes. By the time he finished, his fingers were sore and bleeding, and his uniform stank of fuel and rough hemp. Nobody saw him leave the hangar that night. He didn't log a report, didn't brief the maintenance lead, didn't write a single note in the service record. But as he walked back toward the rows of tents, a strange stillness came over him. For the first time in what felt like forever, he believed he'd actually repaired something that could make a difference. And by sunrise, 3 B-24s would take off into combat, each one carrying that same forbidden strand of rope. Grissom's first test came sooner than he'd imagined. A reconnaissance flight planned to map the Yugoslav coastline had lost its assigned mechanic to illness, and Grissom stepped in without hesitation. 3 B-24s were set to lift off at dawn, their bomb bays filled with cameras instead of explosives. Each one carried his rope fix, tied quietly beneath the gear compartments where no one would look. The risk was silent, unseen, and entirely his. Before sunrise, the engines roared to life, their low thrum shaking across the airstrip like thunder echoing through steel. Mechanics covered their ears with grim familiarity. Grissom climbed aboard Barfly, the lead bomber, his coveralls marked with oil, his skin still carrying the scent of ethanol. Inside the aircraft, the air felt heavy, dense with humidity and constant vibration. He avoided looking at the floor plates where his idea waited for its first real trial. Takeoff went smoothly. The desert below shrank into flat beige dust and shimmering waves of heat. At 2,000 feet, the formation leveled off and pushed into the open blue above the Adriatic Sea. Every rivet buzzed, every surface hummed. The plane felt almost alive, flexing and creaking like some metal creature. Grissom crouched near the rear hatch, tuning in to the airframe's movements. Still nothing, just the steady drone of engines and the dry whisper of wind sliding across the skin of the fuselage. Midway over the water, turbulence struck hard. The bomber lurched, tipping sharply before the pilot leveled it. A low groaning sound came from beneath, a deep, familiar metallic complaint. Grissom's stomach clenched. He yanked open the access panel. Inside the gear bay, the rope was drawn tight, shaking like a taut string. The gear door trembled but stayed shut. The knot held. He pressed his hand against the rope, feeling the vibration pass through his bones. 10 long seconds passed. Nothing gave. Then the tremors ceased. Quiet filled the cabin. The gear remained locked in place. When they landed 2 hours later, Grissom jumped out before the engines had even stopped spinning. He ducked beneath the wing, eyes locked on the gear hatch. The rope was still there, pulled tight, a few threads worn but intact. He sliced it off with his knife, pocketed the frayed end, and said nothing. Behind him, 2 more B-24s rolled to a stop, dust swirling around their tires. Both had returned undamaged. 3 out of 3. It didn't feel real. That afternoon, one of the pilots wandered into the maintenance tent, his face pale and his nerves clearly frayed. "Whoever cinched up my gear, good work," he muttered, lighting a cigarette with a shaky hand. "Thought something jammed back there, but the doors stayed tight. Didn't even flutter." Grissom just shrugged and said, "Sounds like luck." The man nodded, never knowing just how close to the truth that was. But whispers moved faster than a fuel leak. By evening, crew chiefs were trading stories about some mysterious rope trick that fixed the B-24's notorious flaw. Some dismissed it as a joke. Others laughed, calling it nothing but campfire rumor. Still, a few officers began asking questions, sharper ones with a hint of suspicion. Unauthorized modifications could mean court-martial. Grissom knew that as well as anyone. He started removing the tags he'd left behind, quietly scrubbing any signs of what he'd done. But the talk didn't stop. The next morning, a pilot from a different squadron discovered a piece of rope tied to his landing gear strut. He tore it off in the air right after takeoff, shouting into the intercom that someone had tampered with his aircraft. Just minutes later, one of his landing doors broke loose mid-flight, slamming into the fuselage hard enough to sever part of the hydraulic line. They barely got back to the field. When they touched down, smoke poured from beneath the plane, and the gear nearly gave out on landing. Hours later, pale and visibly shaken, the same pilot found Grissom in the hangar. This time, he didn't raise his voice. He simply stared at the mechanic in silence, then muttered, "Whatever that was, don't stop." Grissom didn't respond. He just nodded, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and walked back toward the shadowed hangar. Behind him, the engines of tomorrow's mission were already coughing awake, and hidden deep inside the bombers, the ropes were waiting to be tested in fire. Heat rolled through the hangars in waves, thick as the blast from a furnace. Mechanics worked bare-chested beneath the punishing sun, their shoulders blistered red, their eyes bloodshot from too many sleepless nights. Tool carts clattered across the concrete, engines screamed on the test mounts, and tucked in the shadows behind Tent 3B, a rumor solidified into fact. The rope trick was no longer hidden. Grissom got summoned with no notice. 2 MPs stood at his tent flap before sunrise, their uniforms crisp, their faces unreadable. He followed them silently to the operations shed, where 6 officers waited behind a folding table covered with aircraft blueprints, gear schematics, and a piece of parachute cord, still tied in a knot. No one offered names. A captain shoved a clipboard across the table and said, "Explain this." The knot was still tight. Grissom didn't hesitate. He explained everything: loop tension, sideways resistance, slack as a fail-safe. Each word hit heavy in the warm, stale air. No one spoke until he finished. Then finally a major muttered, "This is crazy." Someone else said, "But it works." 12 planes had flown using the fix. 12 had returned. That was all the proof they needed. By midday, the decision was unofficially made official. The rope mod got approved for immediate field use, under emergency condition only. They didn't attach his name. They didn't even mention it. On the paperwork, it appeared as Supplemental Gear Retention, Field Variant C. Dressed in military jargon, but Grissom recognized the loop from every diagram. Then the rush started. A shipment of 300 feet of extra cord showed up that afternoon, smelling of dust, tar, and ammonia from the dye job done in haste. Mechanics flooded the supply tent. Half had never tied more than a basic hitch in their lives. Grissom taught them himself. Hands flew. Knuckles bled. Cigarettes clenched between teeth as knots were pulled tight beneath the bomber's frames. By the time the clock struck midnight, close to 80 B-24s were outfitted. Then the problems began. The rope stock started to run dry. A delivery had been mistakenly rerouted to a Navy depot. Field crews began improvising with parachute cords, tow cables from tanks, even twisted electrical wire. A few worked. Others didn't. One snapped during a taxi test and tore a jagged hole in the rear wheel casing. Panic spread. Higher-ups called for a halt. Grissom pushed back. "Use proper cord or don't tie anything," he barked at a junior mechanic who tried to rig a fix with signal wire. The boy stepped away. Sleep disappeared. Food got skipped. Voices rose, but still the knots went in. Officers from the 98th and 376th bomb groups came down to inspect the installations themselves. A few grumbled. One called it backwoods engineering. But not a single one ordered the ropes removed once tied. No one could risk it. The crash numbers were no longer rumors. Too many wrecks. Too many scorched landing fields in Corsica, Sicily, and along the Ionian coast. On the final evening before the operation, 172 bombers stood ready in staggered rows across the base, moonlight glinting off every wing. Their undersides held 500-pound bombs. Their doors, each one now reinforced with rope tied in secret hours earlier, looked just like the ones that had once failed. But something was different now. Grissom walked the line alone near midnight. His boots echoed across the cracked airstrip. He ran his fingers along the edge of each gear panel, checking the knots by touch, testing tension without light. The rope still held some heat from the day. It smelled of sweat, dust, and gasoline. At aircraft 146, a gunner leaned out of the hatch. "That the famous fix?" he asked, tapping on the hull with a grin. Grissom didn't reply. He gave the strut a final tug, felt the rope pull tight and hold, then turned without a word. Somewhere behind him, a siren sounded. Just a drill, not an alert. Still, it sliced through the silence like a blade. In less than 2 days, those ropes would meet wind, fire, and metal. And if even one of them gave way, hundreds of lives could be lost. The sky turned silver-gray and flickered as the first wave moved over the Danube. A thin mist curled around the engines, leaving trails of condensation across the cockpit glass. Inside each bomber, the crews sat in tense silence, buckled in tight, hands slick with sweat. The cabin air smelled of breath and cold metal. Guns clattered as the planes dipped lower, descending into a flight path that felt more like falling than flying. At 200 miles an hour, just 30 feet above the ground, every vibration felt amplified. Fields of grass became a green blur beneath the wings. Each B-24's shadow darted like a ghost over farmland, vanishing under trees, reappearing on rooftops, skipping across rivers. The bombers flew so low they stirred dust clouds from the Romanian soil. Their engines thundered in perfect rhythm, each 12-cylinder motor hammering the sky like a piston-driven fist. Grissom wasn't on this flight. His role had ended. He stood back on the runway beside the medic's truck, jaw clenched, hands clasped tightly behind his back. He couldn't see the battle. He could only listen. The faint hum of engines overhead, barely audible even in open air, was the only sign they were still in the fight. Then the static broke loose. Radios burst into life with garbled fragments. One voice yelled over a flak burst. Another barked out altitude changes. A third stuttered something about smoke and fire. Control tried to respond, but the frequency collapsed into chaos. Layers of code, noise, and crosstalk. Someone shouted map coordinates. Another cursed in 3 languages. Then came a pause. Just silence, stretching longer than it should have. Finally, a low voice came through the static. Ropes held. Still flying. Above, hell had opened. Black flak clouds bloomed from hidden emplacements. Explosions split the air with bone-shaking force. Fire trails marked where 2 lead bombers had already gone down, destroyed before they reached their first objective. Wingo Wongo lost its right engine in seconds, spiraled into the tree line, and erupted in flames before half the crew could escape. The fire turned the ground crimson, but the others kept going. Their gear held firm. One pilot radioed that a shell had torn part of the belly clean off, yet the strut stayed locked in place. Another was hit by a sudden updraft so powerful it slammed a gunner against the bulkhead, but the rope didn't fail. On spare parts, the left gear bent from shock, but the rope kept it tucked just high enough to clear a barn roof by inches. Through walls of smoke and flame, they made their bombing runs. The oil refineries lit up like furnaces. Storage tanks ruptured, hurling towers of flame into the haze. Pilots flew directly through the inferno, their eyes burning, fuselages blistering under the heat wave. Some had to lean out broken hatches and toss flares by hand when the bomb bay releases jammed. Every foot of altitude gained meant exposure. Every foot dropped was a gamble, either strike the target or smash into the earth. Still, they flew. And not a single report came through of gear deploying mid-strike. No struts breaking loose. No landing doors torn open by the wind. No liberators torn apart by their own design flaw. Grissom's rope, stretched across steel and silence, had done what factory bolts and regulation brass could not. By 09 o'clock, the first survivors limped back across the Adriatic. Smoke trailed from their wings. Their fuselages were stitched with shrapnel holes. Blood-smeared cockpit windows. Dozens of radios stayed dead, but dozens of planes returned. The first to touch down landed too fast, skimming on worn-out tires, sparks shooting from the belly as it scraped along the strip. The landing gear didn't fold. One tire burst on impact, but the strut didn't collapse. The plane bounced, skidded sideways, then corrected itself. The crew jumped out before the propellers even stopped spinning. One of them, barely more than a kid, hugged the plane's nose and broke down crying. By midday, 54 aircraft were confirmed lost. Over 500 men were killed or captured. The cost was devastating. But it could have been worse. Far worse. Because 340 men flew home in aircraft that, by all logic, should not have survived. And not one of them ever knew their lives had hung on a $5 rope. The airstrip was still when the last of the bombers came home. One by one, the engines sputtered out, their final rattles echoing across the tarmac like dying breaths. Smoke hung low around the hangars. Men climbed from cockpits barefoot, faces streaked black, hands trembling with vibrations that hadn't yet left their bones. There was no applause from the ground crews. They only watched. The raid was finished, but the silence left in its wake felt heavier than the battle itself. Grissom stood near the edge of the strip, his boots buried in powdery dust, eyes locked on the battered bombers taxiing in. Some were shot so full of holes you could crawl through them. Others had wings barely held together with tape and hope. Oil crept across the runway in thick, shimmering pools. The air reeked of burned rubber, cordite, and scorched paint. The first shout came when a mechanic pointed to a gear leg that had stayed locked despite a flak hit. Heads turned. Another bomber rolled in behind it, one tire blown out, both struts untouched. Then another. Shredded wings, broken glass, fuselages torn to pieces, but the gear doors all sealed firm. The news passed fast down the line. The so-called suicide gear had held. Not one door tore loose. No catastrophic failures. Not this time. Nobody mentioned Grissom. The official paperwork credited reinforced mechanical protocols. Engineers patted each other on the back for solutions they hadn't built. Grissom didn't mind. He just stood and watched as crewmen tumbled out of the aircraft, collapsing in the dirt, half laughing, half crying, pressing their faces into the ground like it was sacred. Later that night, under the dull orange light inside the maintenance tent, Grissom sorted through a box of returned gear, tools, oil-stained manuals, empty canisters. At the very bottom, he found a single piece of rope, burnt, stiff, its fibers black with soot. Someone had scrawled in pencil on the faded tag, "Held through Ploesti." He turned it over in his palms, feeling the charred texture. It still smelled faintly of gasoline and sweat. He stayed that way a long while, elbows on his knees, staring at the rope. His thoughts drifted to the ones who hadn't made it back, those whose planes didn't clear the target, whose names were already being etched onto the memorial board. 54 aircraft gone, 500 men killed or captured, whole squadrons erased. Command called it a strategic success. The crews had other words for it. At the morning debrief, Grissom stood silently at the back of the tent. The colonel read off numbers from a clipboard in a dry monotone. Damage assessments, bombing accuracy, casualty rates. There was no mention of the rope fix. On the reports, it was buried deep under technical jargon. Field-approved restraint adaptation. But in the tents, among the gunners and grease-streaked mechanics, the story took a different shape. They started calling it the $5 miracle. Some tied small knots into their uniform sleeves. Others painted cords into their plane's nose art. A quiet tribute to the man who hadn't waited for orders to do what needed doing. Grissom never joined in the talk. He didn't pose for pictures or accept the commendation that eventually came his way. He turned it down with nothing more than a shake of his head. That evening, while the others drank and shouted into the darkness to drown out the ghosts, he sat alone behind the hangar, that piece of rope still in his hands, the memory of the raid echoing softly in his mind. He'd made the fix to stop movement, to hold in place what had no business moving again. But as the night wind swept through the shattered bombers, whistling through ruptured steel and twisted frames, he realized something else had shifted instead. The system had bent. The rules had cracked. And, for once, that had been exactly what was needed. It rested behind glass, dull, unnoticed, nearly forgotten. Just a short piece of rope, no longer than a man's forearm, its threads burned and black from time. The yellowed tag tied to it had curled edges, and the handwriting had faded into a ghost-like blur. Beneath it, a small metal plaque read, "Improvised restraint device, Ploesti, 1943. No name, no honors, just the thing itself, quiet inside its case. Most visitors walked past without pausing. Few saw the fraying strands or the black scorch mark cutting across its center. To them, it looked like nothing, but wrapped in those twisted fibers was a story that never made it into doctrine, never appeared in engineering logs, never showed up in a report. The invention didn't survive on paper, but it survived in metal. By 1944, the official bomber maintenance manuals listed a new line deep in the appendices. Landing gear restraint systems may be supported using flexible auxiliary arresters when situationally required. No background, no author, just regulation written in the cold tone of protocol. But every old crew chief who read it gave a knowing smile. They understood exactly where it had come from. Grissom never told the rope's story. After the war, he went back to Ohio and opened a repair shop in a town too small for most maps. He taught local teens to fix old tractors, to listen to engine timing by sound, and to tie a length of rope tight enough to hold under fire. He married late in life, never had children, and when people asked about the war, he only said, "I kept things working." But others remembered in his place. Veterans from the 376th and 98th wrote down their stories in retirement. Some pages referenced a field mod or a miracle strap. One tail gunner recalled it as, "the last thing I saw before the sky caught fire." In a letter archived at the Air Force Museum, a pilot had scrawled, "We never knew his name, just that somebody out there gave a damn." The years moved on. The war became something in textbooks. Faces turned into faded photos. The bombers themselves rusted in display yards and museum fields. Still, once in a while, an old airman would come to the glass case in Dayton, lean in close to the rope, and simply stand there, breathing in the quiet, remembering what it had once meant. In 1993, a team investigating a crash site outside Ploesti uncovered the twisted remains of a B-24. The wreck was barely recognizable, its frame warped, half-buried, corroded by time. But jammed between two ribs of the landing gear bay, still looped around a bolt, was a blackened length of rope, its knot still holding. No announcement was made. It was sent to the museum without fanfare. Today, it sits under flickering fluorescent light, surrounded by bigger relics, engines, bombs, fragments of fuselage. It doesn't shine. It doesn't stand out. It simply waits, the way it always did, for the pressure to come. And though no label ever says it aloud, every fiber in that rope once held the weight of lives. Men who had no idea just how close they came. Not saved by steel, not rescued by command, but by a $5 knot, tied in the dark, by a man who had decided he'd seen enough.